can you just let people in as they come? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I can handle that, no problem.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to join us today at the 34th. Today's special program, our pre-meeting program, is going to be taking a look at Charter Amendment 29 from both sides. And we have two presenters who are going to just give you two sides of the situation so that you are more informed and brought up to date on the points that are interesting and necessary to know about this really, really important issue. So I will introduce both of our special guests today, and I'll introduce both of them, and then I will hand the mic to each of them to speak, and then we will have time for questions after that. Tim Seiss was deputy mayor of Seattle from 2002 to 2010. He, prior to that, was the chief of staff to King County Executive Ron Sims. He also served as director of King County Endangered Species Act policy. He worked for Gary Locke as Governor Locke and also as King County Executive Locke. Ty Reed is co-chair for House Our Neighbors and is the campaign manager for Nicole Thomas Kennedy. She is a former housing stability specialist. So I would like to have the 34th and all our friends welcome our two presenters today. Claps, cheers, hand waves, however you want to do it. Thank you all for coming. Tim, we're going to start with you on your presentation, and you are the co-host, so you are able to share screen at will, because I know you brought some visuals with you. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you.
Great.
One quick thing before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that the plan is to have both presenters give their presentation. We'll have some time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, and I need to call my meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp. So just let's be respectful to that.
Thanks, Carla. Okay, go ahead, Tim.
All right. Thank you, Bonnie. And good evening, everyone in the 34th District. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here on this beautiful summer evening. I'll unfortunately still on Zoom, but I'm glad everybody's being careful and taking precautions as the Delta variant is rearing its head around the area. I am Tim Seiss. You have my political background. I am also a consultant and been working and living in Seattle my entire life. So I am no stranger to the issues we're going to be discussing today. Compassion Seattle was brought together out of what we saw as the growing crisis of homelessness in our city, and one that we didn't feel was being effectively addressed, and thought it was time for the voters to have a say. So out of that came Charter Amendment 29. I'd like to share a short PowerPoint with you so we can go over the facts of Charter Amendment 29 and then engage in a really good discussion here this evening. I'm looking forward to your questions and the conversation we're about to have. Give me a second here. There we go. Okay. So Compassion Seattle, as I said, is a group of business, civic leaders. We engaged with providers as we were writing the Charter Amendment, and the result was Charter Amendment 29. So the problem statement, I don't think I need to go into great detail about this. We're all experiencing it every day, and we see people in encampments that are in distress and in crisis, and it breaks your heart. We have thousands of unsheltered residents that don't have any housing options, don't have access to mental health or substance abuse disorder services. And, you know, since COVID and starting before then, in 2017, we've seen a growing increase in the number of people living outside unsheltered, as much as a 40% increase countywide. It's a continuing public health and safety crisis, and one that we see every day as we see reports of unsheltered individuals being victimized themselves in these 10 encampments, robberies, sexual assaults, shootings. It almost seems like it's a daily occurrence. And yet we don't have an effective response from the city of Seattle. We have spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars in the preceding years on the problem, but the problem grows only worse. And there is no clear plan coming from the city yet to address the crisis. So let's talk about what Charter Amendment 29 does, because it's actually, although written in charter language and legalese, it's pretty straightforward. First, it requires the city of Seattle to make available through partners like King County, who runs the mental health system, mental health and substance use disorder services. That's not something the city funds today. And this would not have the city set up a separate program or approach, but would have them partner through the existing system and existing service providers and fund those services so they're more available, particularly with a priority for the chronically homeless. It would create a behavioral health rapid response capability as an alternative to police response when an armed police officer can actually escalate a situation. And when someone is in crisis on the streets or even in their home, oftentimes a police officer is not the right response. This is an approach that's been used successfully in other cities and is being piloted here in Seattle with the fire department taking the lead in their response. It would require the city of Seattle to create 2,000 new units of emergency housing within the first 12 months of the effective date of this charter. And emergency housing is defined as anything from enhanced shelter, not mats on the floor, but the enhanced shelter with private spaces and secure storage, that type of thing, to tiny homes, to hotel rooms, to even permanent supportive housing. So the definition is very broad about what emergency housing is available. It also allows the city to work with the county and to count any regional housing units that are developed to address the chronic homeless problem as part of that 2,000 units. So it's a very achievable number. Right now, remember, there's about 4,000 people by estimates living outside in Seattle. That would serve about half in the first year. And then, of course, another 2,000 units would be necessary over time for the city to fully address the unhoused population in Seattle. As those services are made available, and first of all, it is a continuum. The city must make available those services, must make available the housing, must offer them, must do the outreach. And only then, after that work has been done and people have been placed, can the city clear encampments. Now, this is based really on the Just Cares model that's being used right now successfully around downtown Seattle to remove some very difficult encampments. Been used successfully in Pioneer Square, been used successfully on 3rd Avenue, and it's being used right now as we speak at the Courthouse Park in downtown Seattle outside the King County Courthouse. And what they're finding is the vast majority of those people will accept housing and will accept that approach so that they can move out of their unsheltered circumstance. Given the opportunity to have a place, they will take it. It also establishes a dedicated fund in the city treasury for these purposes. That fund will have to be supplied with 12% of the city's annual general fund, so it's allocated to human service programs, including these homeless services. That's a floor. That is not the ceiling. So if the city determines more money is necessary, certainly the city council and the mayor can do that. If they determine that they need to raise revenue to accomplish this, that is still within their legislative authority. Nothing in this charter amendment prevents them from tapping other revenues or going after additional revenues. It also reinforces, and this is an important part, the partnership now with the new regional homeless authority. And it reinforces and requires the city to stay in that arrangement. And then finally, the charter amendment sunsets in 6 years. And the reason we chose a 6-year sunset is there was a lot of discussion about, well, if we solve the problem, should this stay in the charter beyond that time? Or if it doesn't work, should it still be in the charter? And so we felt that 6 years was an appropriate amount of time to prove that the approach works. And then it can be self-sustaining after that. Or if it doesn't work, which we believe it will, but if it should not for some reason, then the charter amendment goes away. So with that, I'll stop and I'll let Ty make her presentation. Then I really do look forward to your questions as we move on tonight. Thank you. And let me stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you, Tim. Ty, I will pass the mic, as it were, to you, and I will put your contact information in the chat for everybody to see, as I did with Tim's as well. So thank you very much, Tim. And Ty, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it, and the statements from Tim as well. They already kind of gave an introduction to me, so I will talk about House Our Neighbors. House Our Neighbors is a coalition of unhoused and housed advocates, homelessness advocates, who came together after the Charter Amendment 29 had been released, and we kind of coalesced specifically around the section that speaks to encampment removals, or sweeps, as a lot of people know them. We are a coalition of people led by the Lived Experience Coalition, Nicholsville, which is a self-managed tiny house village, Share and Wheel, which is a self-managed tent cities and shelters, the American Civil Liberties Union, Real Change Transit Riders Union, and we've been endorsed by the 37th, the 34th, and the 43rd Legislative District Democrats, UFCW21, and dozens of other organizations and individuals. So as you can see, we represent a diverse, a really diverse community of housed and unhoused experts in homelessness who know what needs to be done to solve this crisis. And so when we looked over this charter amendment, we did so with experience, expertise, and a discerning eye towards detail. So one of the big things, and I really appreciate Tim's presentation because it speaks to the crises. I'll correct some of those numbers. I think it's about, as the point in time count for Seattle last year was about 8,000 people who lived unhoused, both in different kinds of shelter and outside, and about 67%, or like 5,000-ish, lived like literally unsheltered outside somewhere. So those numbers are really devastating, and I 100% with what Tim said about what these people are going through in terms of struggle, what they're experiencing, and the need to act immediately. Now, what I will say about the charter amendment is that it is full of empty promises that are deliberately meant to prey on everybody in the city's genuine desire for real solutions that will work. This charter amendment was drafted with zero consideration for how to be implemented. Even if questioned, the backers of Charter Amendment 29 will say that this is a plan, that it's a start towards solutions, but in reality, a lot of these things I'll talk about can't even be defined, and we don't know what it'll look like after it's passed. We will hear tales about how it requires the city to do this or to do that or to meet this requirement. But in reality, it's a bigger gamble for our city to make than we actually should be risking. And so I'll go into some details about what are really striking about this charter amendment and the lack of planning that will go into it that makes it almost impossible to determine what will come out of it. So a lot of the things I'll be referencing, just for like citation, are coming from a memo that the city council had their central staff create to figure out what this charter amendment would look like in terms of cost analysis. What they determined was that most of this amendment would need follow-up policy or legislation to clarify all of the provisions, almost all of the provisions that Tim mentioned, including the 2,000 units of, quote, emergency or permanent housing. As you can imagine, emergency or permanent housing could run the gamut, from anything that's just non-congregate shelter, which is another word that is undefined. So we don't know what we're going to get in terms of emergency or permanent housing. That could be 2,000 hotels that immediately go away after a while. It could be tiny house villages. It could be for rapid rehousing, or basically anything the city is already engaged in. So there's some ambiguity there that makes it kind of hard to determine what these 2,000 units will look like and who in the city they will actually serve. These 2,000 new units could actually already be done already. The central staff stated that because it was undefined in the way that it was written, this could include projects already in the works, like things that were created by the Jumpstart tax, or things that came, housing that came from the American Rescue Plan, or it could require totally new housing. Just depending on how this is interpreted, which we don't know how it's been interpreted yet, this could look like a lot of different things. But one thing that the central staff did say, and they and all seem to agree on, and I'll say it's a direct quote from the memo, regardless of the combination of units created, it is unlikely that the city could develop 2,000 additional units of housing or shelter within 12 months, even if the city leverages previously planned development to meet this requirement. So the people who would actually determine whether this happened or not, or who would have to translate this amendment, have already said they couldn't fulfill that requirement. Another thing that Tim talked about that is extremely crucial right now for people living unhoused and housed is low barrier, rapid access, mental health and substance use disorder treatment. That's what is referred to in the charter amendment. And the way that it is worded, it says that the city shall help fund. That means that the funding that we're already putting for some of this might already be met as a requirement, depending on how it's interpreted. Or it could be interpreted to mean that we have to expand those services. And the analysis done by the city determined that this could range from $17 million, which is very doable, to over $100 million, depending on what services we provide. Regarding the regional authority, I personally did not live in the city during the time when the regional authority got discussed. I know some about it, but what I do know is that there's been a lawsuit that was filed today that argues that this initiative contradicts the recent creation of that regional homelessness authority. So we'll see in the next few weeks how that turns out legally, but the regional authority part is already deeply in question. And now we'll turn to the 12% of funding for Human Services Fund from the annual general fund. Again, these undefined terms, which might sound like I'm being nitpicky, are really important. It tells us that based off of how you would interpret this, this could mean that we are way overfunding this, depending on how you define it, or we are totally underfunding that 12%. And I think I want to get stuck on these undefined terms because what you just heard from the person who's trying to sell it to you was surface level, and it didn't talk about deeply getting into the details, and the details matter. We are dealing with a decades-long crisis that really needs attention to detail and a real plan based on research and data that can really resolve our crisis, not just maybe this or maybe that. In addition to the 12% being ambiguous and undefined, the analysis of what human services and homelessness is, there are no defined terms for that either. So we could be totally underfunding this already, or we could have already funded the requirements in this charter amendment, making them moot. For a lot of things, we don't know because those terms haven't been defined in the amendment. And I'll end on the encampment removals. They will be described as not sweeps. Tim said that no encampment removal will happen until everybody's gone. But if everybody's gone, if everybody's been housed and everything, what are you sweeping, right? People should have been somewhere, right? But what is going to happen is that they will offer services to some people, but the language in their charter amendment says verbatim, in those circumstances where the city does not close an encampment, the city may still require individuals to shift their belongings in any structures to ensure safety, accessibility, and to accommodate the use of public spaces. That sentence is extremely important because it makes clear that this charter amendment, at least partially, is undeniably codifying sweeps into our city's constitution. These are an ineffective and inhumane practice of shuffling people around. Even if you don't consider them inhumane, when you move people from one part of the city to another, you're not effectively ending homelessness, you're just effectively ending seeing visible homelessness. And there's no proof that people receive housing of any kind or that they don't return to the streets after they receive temporary shelter. So any kind of positive spin on what can happen out of sweep doesn't exist. Those people will inevitably live back up on the streets, and sometimes the same exact encampment that they've been removed from. And so very briefly, I'll talk about who's behind Compassion Seattle. It might be Tim here today, but really this is a charter amendment that was constructed by the Chamber of Commerce, Downtown Seattle Association, real estate investors and developers, basically the richest people in our city. They are deeply unserious about solving our homelessness crisis. That is why the Chamber is appealing the judge's dismissal of their lawsuit against the Jumpstart tax, a tax that would actually start to fund affordable housing and start to create relief for people who are suffering from consequences of COVID. They are the people who will directly benefit from codifying sweeps into our charter and bogging down our government with trying to figure out how to interpret this amendment, all the while sweeps continue and our homelessness crisis worsens. Their website uses deeply misleading and unsighted research to convince you that somehow this is data driven. They have an unpublished poll that states that 71% of people support the amendment, and unsighted statistic that says that homelessness is voters' top concern. Those two numbers are not data that should inform how our entire charter should look. That doesn't make any sense to lead our homelessness crisis based off of those two numbers. I was waiting to hear who Tim would say has endorsed the organization, because from my experience, I have not seen anybody publicly endorse them who hasn't taken their endorsement back. Whereas we are a coalition of people who currently experience homelessness, people who have experienced homelessness in the past, and those who work directly with them. And I will say that for people who constantly rail against our city council for failing to act, they have written an amendment that would require that same city council to determine every single metric, every single requirement, every single provision in that amendment, except for the parts that codify sweeps. That is crystal clear. Our solutions as advocates for homelessness have been ongoing, and they'll continue beyond this amendment. We are people who have been advocating for tiny house villages, people who joined the Stay House, Stay Healthy Coalition to win renters protections in Seattle, King County. Real Change is a huge driver of this coalition, and they've been advocating for homelessness issues for decades. We are supported by people on the ground in mutual aid groups who are providing essential supplies and services to people experiencing sweeps today. We have experience solving homelessness, and we've been begging the city to solve homelessness in real ways with a real plan, not with a charter amendment that can't live up to any of its promises. I will end on that, and I look forward to all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty, and thank you, Tim. We have a bunch of questions here. I'm going to pull questions and I'm going to ask them. I invite both of you to answer them. Some of them are directed specifically, so I will just read them as I see them, as they were typed to me. This question is for Tim, but I think, Ty, if you have information that you can add to it, that would be great. So Tim, you mentioned that Just Cares is being used successfully now. Could you please define success in terms of the outcome for the unhoused person? Tim, I think you're on mute. Great, there you go.
There we go. Oop. So yeah, thanks, great question. Just Cares is a relatively new program. Lisa Dugard from the Public Defenders Association, who is one of our endorsers and supporters, has put this program together, and it's an intensive outreach to individuals living in encampments that includes the offer of housing, and it's not shelter. She's using primarily hotel rooms right now, and the access to services to help them stay in that housing. And so the intensive outreach is to help them make the decision to leave and go into permanent housing. Success is they accept the offer. That's quite simply the metric. And frankly, in the instances where she's been using this approach, it's probably been about 90% successful in getting people into permanent housing or emergency housing. And there are some people who decline, and that's a fact. And they move on, that's, you can't always guarantee 100% success, but this approach has really shown remarkable results in the few times it's been used. And right now, it's being used in probably the most difficult encampment in the city outside of courthouse, the King County Courthouse and City Park. And we'll see the test of that in that instance.
Ty, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I will say that a program that houses certain people, not even houses, hotels certain people at certain camps for a specific certain time. I remind people that we were very concerned that people would get kicked out of hotels because they are at risk of losing funding. Housing people in hotels temporarily from certain camps is not a solution. There are, I can't say hundreds, but definitely dozens of camps that I've personally visited where they're never going to be visited by Just Cares. They're up in different dangerous parts under the freeway. Certain places, I agree, do get Just Cares. And I do believe that certain people get housing. I even believe that certain people end up in tiny house villages. What is the scale of that model? Is it hundreds? Is it thousands like we need?
Well, that's the point. And the charter amendment would require these approaches to be scaled up. That's the point of the whole thing. And the alternative shouldn't be just to leave people in place in misery and in crisis in these encampments.
I have a follow-up, which comes from a question from our audience, but I think relates to this very point that we're talking about. And that is, what happens to a homeless person living in a tent who rejects any help from the city? And I offer this to both of you. So Ty, go ahead.
I will speak to this as someone who provides sweep support, meaning that I show up to sweeps at 7 a.m. before they occur to actually help those people who quote unquote reject services. I want to get rid of this idea that people have that people reject services. No, what happens is Human Services Department comes to a camp full of offers for maybe 12 shelters. Maybe they're a women's shelter, maybe they're co-ed, maybe you can't do drugs, maybe you have to be a certain age, maybe you have to not be sick or something. There's all these requirements. So yes, some people might get offered services, but so many people, those services can't help, they will reject them. And then the city gets to say, well, look at these people who rejected this, who rejected these services. Did you ask whether the service met their need? Was it in a congregate shelter? This is even pre-COVID. Was it in a congregate shelter? Were they able to take a pet that was really serious to them and that would help them maintain their mental health? Were they able to go with their partner who maintains their mental health? Were they able to go there and maybe use alcohol or other substances to alleviate their pain? If those markers if those questions can't be answered for a lot of people, yes, they will reject basic congregate shelter. But when that does happen and shelters, the services don't meet their needs, they go to another encampment. I want to emphasize, even if you house one entire camp, people are moving all over. I help them do it. When I help people move out of encampments, I just move them across the street, because there's nowhere to go. People are not being offered service. We take their tents, we take their belongings, we take their family's ashes, and we move them across the street because the city sits there and watches while people's needs are not being met, while they offer services they know do not meet people's needs. And so yes, people do just get moved around the city. I can show you pictures, I can show you videos. It happens every week.
Tim, did you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. I actually think Ty's absolutely right. The current effort by the city of Seattle is broken. It's resulting in moving people from one miserable situation to another. And that's why Charter Amendment 29 was developed, was because the current situation is not working. We have been at this for decades, and it's time for a different approach. And so the model that Charter Amendment 29 envisions, and if you get a chance, please do read the actual language of the Charter Amendment, because it specifies that the outreach needs to be culturally competent, that it needs to be tailored to the needs of the people that are being addressed. And it's very specific language in there, so that it's not just this, hey, here's one size fits all, take it or leave it. That's not what Charter Amendment 29 does. It really is a very intensive outreach model to help people realize that they have an opportunity to move into housing, identify the services and support that they might need to be able to sustain that housing situation. So yeah, I think Ty and I are in violent agreement here on the current system. But The difference between us is that defeating Charter Amendment 29 and hoping for change of this current system and leaving people in their current situation is really not an answer. And I will tell you that the other side of this argument has yet to come forward with a specific plan how to change all the terrible things Ty just described. But Charter Amendment 29 does.
This is a great segue, thank you, into the next question from our audience.
Rachel, can I make a quick comment? I would just like to ask that we use the chat only for questions and keep your comments and your opinions about either side of this for later in the agenda tonight. We are going to have an opportunity to debate this, an endorsement for this amendment. And I really want to keep the chat clear for questions, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Okay, so sorry, here's our next question from our audience. It is clear that the concerns about Compassion Seattle's amendment is that there are aspects that are difficult to implement or may not be fully realized. What is not clear is what is an alternative to this amendment that would meet the goal of helping those who are unsheltered find sustainable housing? To both of you, it's not a direct question.
Okay, I hope it's okay if I go first then.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, that is an excellent question. As a housing advocate, I like to be solution oriented. The coalition, despite us being made up of multiple different organizations, agrees on one thing that's, backed by research that was requested a couple of years ago. We need millions of dollars of progressive taxation, the same kind of progressive taxation that the backers of Charter Amendment 29 are fighting. No bones about it. McKinsey report said $450 million to $1.1 billion every year for 10 years to end that crisis. And honestly, because of COVID, that number is likely high. I mean, don't cite me on that, but I would assume that number has gotten higher. If you're not talking about spending billions of dollars to build housing when you know our housing stock has not kept up with our population and serving people as you get them housed, you're not being serious. I do think that people need a lot of the services that are in Charter Amendment 29, but no plan for housing, for building housing, extremely low-income housing for 0 to 30% AMI. Where are these people going to go after that temporary shelter? Where are people going to go after a tiny house village? We can only have so many in the city. There's no long-term plan for permanent housing. When it's mentioned, it's emergency or permanent housing. We can imagine which one's actually going to get built. We need, I would say, social housing, but at least cheap market rate housing, well, maybe not market rate, to solve this homelessness crisis. There are many things that go into it in terms of serving people in vehicles, making sure we have hygiene centers, bathrooms, street sinks, services at CAMS, behavioral mental health services that come to you. Aside from all that, people need somewhere to go. And just by the numbers, nobody can argue that Seattle is on track to build the amount of housing that we need for the number of people we have.
Tim?
Yeah, thank you. Charter Amendment 29 has a requirement for 2,000 units of emergency housing. I described that definition. It can range from enhanced shelter, which is not congregate shelter. It is not a mat on the floor. It is privacy and secure storage. Tiny homes, hotel rooms, all the way up to permanent supportive housing. What Ty describes is an affordable housing crisis in this city for very low income and homeless people. Which is true, that exists. But the city is only able to produce a minimal amount of those units every year because it's expensive, number one. The city's contribution to those units is about $100,000 per unit. And then you have to go through the permitting and build them. And it's very long. It takes 3 to 5 years to bring a unit online. Now, if the answer is to leave people in encampments and in RVs and while this happens, I don't think that's acceptable. And that's not a compassionate solution to people living unsheltered in our city. We can help them move into a stable housing unit while we address that affordable housing crisis that Ty described, but leaving people outside should not be the default.
Okay, we have more questions. They're just rolling in. The next question is, there appear to be a number of spending requirements for the city. In the amendment, this is in the amendment, it also removes the city sales tax on building materials used to provide the required housing. This is a good segue as well. How does that impact the city's budget at a time when revenues already are reduced because of the pandemic?
First of all, cities' revenues are growing after the pandemic. The economic recovery, they are now exceeding their revenue forecasts significantly. Plus, if the Jumpstart tax does hold, which I think it probably will, there's several $100 million a year in revenue there that the city is anticipating. So yes, there are spending requirements here. And the provisions of mental health and substance abuse disorder services are something the city doesn't pay for today. And the system is desperately underfunded. So that's a necessary service for the people dealing with homelessness in these tent encampments. It's up to the city to deal with the budget, but we believe that if the number one priority for the residents of the city of Seattle is to solve the homeless problem, and Ty, I will tell you, the number was 59% identified that voluntarily as the number one issue, then it should be the number one priority for the city to address and fund and help create an effective program to address it.
Ty, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I was looking for the number, but I'm going to say based off of that report that I keep going to, I really do encourage people to look at it. I believe the number was a max of $7.6 million to waive some of those permits and regulations or whatever the taxes you were talking about that are part of it. Like I said earlier, the people who are real estate developers, investors who are behind this amendment will be directly benefiting by developing. Like that to me seems very obvious, but even really that number is quite small, 7.6 million in the grand scheme of things. I want us to really think about the fact that none of those numbers are locked in. Like I said about the behavioral services, which we do actually, the city does pay for some behavioral mental health services. The range for actually meeting the requirements laid out in the charter amendment could be $17 million or over $100 million. We do not know. Tim couldn't tell you. Nobody from Compassion Seattle could give you a number on how much we're going to spend. They're going to leave it to the same council that they believe hasn't been able to fix this crisis to determine all of those numbers, all of those programs, all of those metrics. And I just don't understand how that's going to be even more effective, especially considering that some of those requirements, I'm going to emphasize, we already meet depending on the interpretation of the words you're using. Behavioral mental health services, we might already meet that requirement based off of, this is just what central staff has said. I mean, you could disagree with the city council, but I'm just going off of how they would enact this. And they're saying that we might already meet some of these metrics. So I'm concerned that this actually wouldn't build up the services that it allegedly will.
So we have another question. If the amendment would sunset in 2027, why would we want to have it in this critical governing document? If we are not sure of the outcomes, why codify it in law?
So first of all, it was a long discussion about whether to approach this as a standard initiative, which is like an ordinance at city council, or use the charter to establish this as a policy of the city. And again, remember, a charter is a policy document, and it does require implementation after that is adopted. And Ty rightly pointed that out, that the mayor and the city council were responsible for implementing the policies that the voters approve in Charter Amendment 29. But it does give them very clear and precise policy guidance on what to do. The reason to put it in the charter was also it's more binding. Again, an initiative can be amended by the city council by a majority vote after 2 years, whereas the charter amendment can only be changed by going back to the people. We also felt that a 6-year sunset was sufficient because, again, as I said earlier in this presentation, if the program and the policies work, it will no longer be needed in the charter. If they should not work for some reason, we don't believe that to be the case, but if they should not work, then the charter shouldn't be burdened with that policy any longer. But 6 years should be sufficient that we should know if it works, and then it'll be embedded in what the city does. And hopefully, after 6 years, finally, we will have made some significant progress in alleviating the crisis that we're imposing on people living in encampments.
Hi,
Is the question just why a charter amendment?
well, I think this was, if the amendment would sunset in 2027, why would we want to have it in this critical governing document? We're not sure of outcomes, why codify it in law?
I have that same exact question. That's why I didn't know if it was addressed to me or not. I don't really see any compelling reason why you would have a sunset clause in your charter in this way, despite the explanation that Tim just gave. So I think that's a valid question that I really don't have an answer for.
How many this is the next question. How many homeless participated, let's say unhoused folks, participated in the charter amendment wording, and what did they bring to it?
We worked with providers that work with the homeless folks, and so Chief Seattle Club, Plymouth Public Defenders Association, and United Way and others on the wording. We did not reach out directly to people with lived experience. I think that was an oversight that we are continuously rectifying by talking to them now and hearing their concerns. But we did work directly with the providers that have been working with them for a very, very long time.
Ty, did you want to add anything there?
Just that I think noting that they did not work with people actually experiencing homelessness who know what their needs are, but they did work with not direct service workers, because I used to be a direct service provider. They worked with the executive directors of organizations who do not work with people experiencing homelessness. There is a clear divide. I don't know if anybody here works with a boss, but I'm going to be honest, the executive director does not know what people need the same way people who work directly with them do. That is why our coalition is made up with people who don't just have lived experience, people who work directly with them, people from REACH who do outreach every day, whose executive director might agree or disagree, but they know exactly what people need and how sweeps are devastating and how people need housing and these different services. So yes, I believe that Tim did talk to executive directors of nonprofit corporations. I do not believe he talked to people who know what their needs are. And you can tell because there's no mention of people living in their vehicles in the charter amendment, and over about 50% of people living unhoused are living in vehicles, and none of that is mentioned. So we're not even talking about half of the population here.
Another question, how will the funding of allocations being proposed by Compassion Seattle build the number of units or staff the programs that we need to actually get people off the streets and into permanent safe housing?
Yeah, the implementation of Charter Amendment 29 is going to be a requirement that the mayor and the city council are going to have to work on. The amount of money that will be appropriated for this will be their decision. You cannot legally legislate or budget through an initiative process or through a charter amendment. That's not an appropriate topic for a charter amendment. That is strictly a legislative power invested in the mayor and the city council. But what Charter Amendment 29 does do, it gives them a very clear roadmap and the expectations for the results. It's clear that they are to produce 2,000 units of, and by the way, the Charter Amendment says new housing. I don't know what's ambiguous about the word new. They need to do that in the first year. So again, this will be a lot of work for the city. But it gives them for the first time a clear focus and stops the debate internally to the city, which has been raging for years now about what's the right approach to help people in encampments. Charter Amendment 29 lays out a clear path and a clear plan.
Thank you for that, Tim. Those 2,000, so the word new actually is quite ambiguous, like I said. 2,000 new units could mean units that we've already set aside for Jumpstart, so that wouldn't really be new. Units that we've already set aside for the American Rescue Plan, so that wouldn't really add to the situation. Or it could be brand new units like Tim's talking about. But they haven't laid out that plan. They didn't take the time to specifically say, we want you to build 2,000 brick and mortar permanent housing units that have these services, that have bike racks and all these things. That's a little too much. But they didn't do that. What they just said is 2,000 permanent, like new emergency or permanent housing units. I'm telling you, the central staff is saying that they would not know how to interpret it. It would be up to interpretation by the same city council and the same mayor that we are saying has allegedly failed the city to do any of these things. And when it comes to the revenue, there's this number of 12% of the annual general fund. I want to emphasize again, the city itself does not know how to interpret that yet. Once it passed, then we would have to spend the months and the work to figure out, is that a number that we're already meeting? So we're cool, we're Gucci, it's fine? Or is that something we need to start figuring out where the money's coming from because we're underfunding that 12% limit? Once again, we don't know. Tim can't say what the city will do in terms of that money or what kind of all of these different housing units. There's a large range between doing 2,000 hotels and 2,000 apartments. That is humongously different. We need numbers. We need an estimate. We need a reason for why 2,000 when even Tim's saying it's 4,000, right? There are actually over 5,000 people living unhoused by point in time numbers. I implore you to Google these numbers. In January 2020, there were like 11,000 people in all of King County. 71% of them were in Seattle, and 67% of those were actually living unsheltered out of anything. That's nowhere near 2,000. And so I really want to get into these numbers because they're going to matter.
Why, Ty? I tell you, I'm sorry, but you throwing up a bunch of dust and confusion about this. Let's be really clear. 2,000 is a very clear number in the first year, and it gives the city a target. And for the first time, they have a target to achieve. It doesn't solve the whole problem in the first year. Nothing is going to. That would be an absurd expectation. But it's a good start, and we need to begin. And just to say that it's not, you don't think it's clear is an absurd argument. It's very clear. And I urge people in this room to actually read the language of the charter amendment. I think it's very clear.
Ty, do you have a response?
Yes, I would say read the language of the charter amendment. And if I may, I will put this memo from the city that did a cost analysis that talks about very quickly, like very deliberately, I think it's like 16 pages, everything that has a cost attached to it. I will say that things that they couldn't determine the cost, they took out. But I'm not making these numbers up. The point in time count can be looked into. We might not have done it this year, but we did it in 2020. And that number exists. It's over 4,000 people. It's more like 8,000 people when you include shelter. And the 2,000 units. And the 2,000
let's get started on getting them housed.
Exactly. So what if I told you that the 2,000 units are already done? The requirement of the amendment is that they're already done.
Tim, hang on.
What Tim refuses to accept is that they used undefined terms, and so they themselves cannot say whether these units are already in the works, whether they would be completely brand new ones, whether they would come from the Jumpstart tax or the American Rescue Plan. He can't say that because it isn't clearly delineated what new means. New could be in progress. New could be fresh out of the dome. There's no definition in this charter amendment. So these promises are 100% empty. And I refuse to just accept this interruption that tells me that I'm wrong when I use facts and figures and he came here with an empty promise.
Wow.
Okay.
I would like people to acknowledge the comments that interrupting the presenter is really unacceptable, and the moderators could please mute Tim when this happens. Would it be happening if this is not a woman person of color?
Wow.
I think I am going to give the benefit to both of our presenters and to ask the presenters if we could just give the time and respect to each person to speak without speaking over them. For both of you, that would be fantastic. And because we have a lot of questions, and this topic is sensitive, it's very important. And I think there are a lot of people with a lot of feelings. So I appreciate everybody that we're trying to hold it together to keep it civil so that we can get the most information to everybody. Let me bring in another question here.
And Rachel, let me just cut in for a moment. We probably have time for one more question. It's 7 minutes left.
7 minutes left.
Yep.
Okay. Let me just say this before we go on really fast. If your question did not get asked and it was just simply because of time, please feel free to look in the chat. I've posted both contact information for both Tim's organization and Ty's organization. Please feel free to forward your questions to them after this program, and they will be happy to respond to your questions. This is directed to Tim. Our audience would like to hear Tim's response to the concern that it seems like this charter amendment legally binds the city and therefore also makes us liable to fulfilling and being sued over new thresholds without generating a way to pay for it. It seems disingenuous to pass off the lack of funding as a positive and a way for the city council to have flexibility when the issue at hand is not that there is a lack of interest, but a lack of adequate funding. So Tim, we'll start with you, and then Ty, you can respond.
Sure. So yes, the charter amendment is legally binding on the city. That's the purpose of the charter, and that's the purpose of using it in the charter as a charter amendment. They have to perform, and they have to meet the policy objectives of the charter amendment. As far as revenue goes, again, as I said earlier in this conversation, there is nothing in this charter amendment that limits the authority of the city of Seattle, the council or the mayor, to propose or enact new revenues to pay for these services or any other services that they may choose to fund. The fact of the matter is that city revenues are up considerably post-COVID pandemic and the economic recovery that is occurring. We've also been the recipient of hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funds. And there's also revenues coming in from the Jumpstart, as has been pointed out. So it is how to pay for this. We believe that 12% of the general fund is a good floor, requiring them to commit to solving the number one priority of the city. And again, if the city council should decide that they need to ask the voters or use their own authority to enact new revenue, that is entirely within their prerogative to do so. Nothing in this charter amendment limits that.
Ty?
Can I ask you real quick, just to repeat that? I think I missed the last half, the question part.
Okay, let me just scroll back to it. Concerned that it seems like this charter amendment legally binds the city, therefore making us liable to fulfilling and being sued over new thresholds without generating a way to pay for it. It seems disingenuous to pass off the lack of funding as a positive and way for the city council to have flexibility when the issue at hand is not that there is lack of interest, but a lack of adequate funding.
I agree with the disingenuous part. I think that coming from business, ambiguous businesses and civic leaders, finding out that they're suggesting that we spend money on homelessness, an undetermined amount, that's beyond our wildest dreams. Every other time as a homelessness advocate, you tried to work with business, they want hard numbers, they want a plan. But now it seems to make sense to keep the plan as loosey-goosey as possible. So I agree with that statement. It does seem disingenuous. And I'll also mention there already is a lawsuit filed today, or litigation filed against Charter Amendment 29 from the ACLU, from Transit Riders Union, from the Seattle Homelessness Coalition. I'm sorry, it's Homelessness Service Coalition. I'm really bad at those. But that represents over 77 organizations. So you've got 77 organizations who actually deal with homelessness in the coalition, and the American Civil Liberties Union and Transit Riders Union, which is a leftist org that advocates for housing and transit. They're already suing. And so we're already looking at these consequences. And so we should think hard and long about how long it's going to take to implement, how many times we're going to get sued, how much it's going to cost us to get through all of that. I agree with Tim, and I'll end it on this. We do need solutions, but I want a real plan that lays out the details that we talked about instead of leaving it up ambiguously into the air. I want it laid out. We're taking money from these sources. We're taking, these percentages, something that actually is concrete. But what we've gotten now here is that it's a positive to be a charter amendment because it's not super binding in some ways, but it's also a positive to be a charter amendment because it is super binding, but then also we can change it. I think that we should question why there's so much ambiguity around this charter amendment coming from, once again, the business community and millionaires and billionaires.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left, so I'm not sure that we have time for another question. However, please, everybody, I implore you, go. I'm going to see if I can get these 2 links up. Can you, but Ty and Tim, can you put your orgs, your .orgs there into the chat one more
yes.
time, just so everybody can.
Wait, Sarah can take care of that. It's in the script and we'll take care of that for them.
Okay, I just want to make sure that everybody knows there is a place that you can direct your questions. Both Ty and Tim will be happy to answer your questions. And I do want to thank both of you for joining us today. I feel like it was a really informative and energized conversation and on this urgent matter. So thank you again, everybody, for coming. We are going to be switching over to our membership meeting. Ty and Tim, you are more than welcome to join us. And Kate, looks like I saw you in the audience as well. So please join us for our meeting, and where we're going to be looking at this charter amendment to whether to approve or not tonight. So come on in and we'll see you in a few. Thanks again, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim and Ty. I appreciate the passion, really on both sides. I think we're all here wanting the same things. And, it's a really hard emotional subject. And I appreciate, solutions from any side at this point. And I think we could all agree on that at least. All right, I'm going to stop our video.